Hey, what's going on? So basically, I was going through my computer and I found all this footage, and I apparently just forgot to upload it. I started to edit it, and I guess other parts came in and I got ahead of myself and started putting stuff together and filming other things that I thought were more interesting, and just kind of forgot about this little bit, which is kind of sort of crucial for the you know, as far as information goes for the build. Basically, in this video, I'm just measuring bearing clearances. You know, I had just got the block back, and I just wanted to check out and make sure everything was still in spec, because the crank was polished, but it wasn't machined any. It was just polished. But I just wanted to make sure that too much material wasn't taking off, because the crank was already pretty close to the end of its service life. One of the things I found out, well, one of the things, well, I already knew, but just watching the video again kind of got me thinking, and now I'm kind of worried about how wide those crank clearances are. You know, the spec for Mazda is .004, that's the max allowable bearing clearance. But the standard is like 001 to like 002 or something along the lines of that. So I mean, it's pretty far off, or my crank is pretty far off from what Mazda recommends, but it's within the maximum allowance. You know, race engines generally run pretty wide bearing clearances. For the purpose of, you know, race engines, things are being thrashed around, making a lot of power. You know, the crank is actually going to wobble and move and things. So, I mean, not anything that you would see with your naked eye, but, you know, so you run slightly wider clearances, so that if that crank does start to deflect, you don't run as much of a chance of thrashing the bearings. The problem with running the wider clearances is low oil pressure. Basically, you're just going to have oil seeping out between the crank pin and the bearing surface. Not a huge problem. You know, if you look up some other manufacturers, the maximum that Mazda recommends is the standard what other engines may run. But, you know, I'm just kind of worried, because even with the high flow oil pump, I'm still kind of worried about low oil pressure. So I was doing some research, and it turns out that alright, so ACL makes a bearing that is 1 thou larger, so it would effectively take 1,000 off of all of my measurements, and that puts me a lot closer to what Mazda recommends, while still being on the looser side, without being so close to that maximum limit. So I'm kind of wondering if I should go ahead and buy those bearings and pull the crank back out of the block and replace the bearings with something that's a slightly tighter fit. So, you know, if anybody out there has any opinions on what I should do, or, you know, obviously have experience with putting these engines together, or engine building in general, you know, I'd love to hear your opinion on it. I'm still pretty far away from finishing the engine and putting it back in the block, or back in the engine bay, so, you know, I've got some time to ponder it. Leave a comment, let me know. Love to hear from you. Thanks. Alright, so got the block and everything else back from the machine shop, all cleaned up, nice and pretty. The only problem I had was a problem I kind of already knew I was going to have, and that is that the crankshaft is at the end of its service life. The journals are just kind of worn down to a point to where if I were to have the crank turned down, I'd have to go with an undersized bearing and blah blah blah, and I just, yeah. So it's still within spec. It's just, it's right at the very end of what Mazda would recommend for the bearing clearance. I mean, it's right there, you know. So just to double check, you know, I checked it the correct way using a micrometer, measuring the bearing journals, and then measuring the bore, and then, you know, subtracting the two measurements. I'm going to go ahead and do a dry assembly and use some platigage and just get a, you know, a second opinion. Even though I know platigage is a lot less accurate, but yeah, just want to give, you know, just give it a shot, see where I end up at. So go ahead and start that. Not using any assembly lube, just put the bearings in, drop the crank in, use a little platigage. Very careful not to damage the bearings because they are very expensive. Doesn't scratch the back of the bearing. Before I do that, I want to make sure that all the journals are free of any debris. So I'm just gonna very carefully try not to turn this because, like I said, this is going together dry. There's no lube, there's nothing in there to really protect anything. But if I lube it, it'll throw the... I need to rotate it though, because I don't want to be on this. I'll lift her up. I gotta throw my cap. Oh, before I throw my caps on, I need to put my platigage in. You know, all the caps are numbered, and they have a nice little arrow to point in the direction towards the front of the engine, because you do not want to mix them up. Each cap is machined for its specific location. I'm not using this to torque. I was kind of using it as a speed tool. I will be tightening these in sequence. 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Figure I might as well torque it to spec. .42. Alright, now break them loose, reverse order. Alright, so there you can see the little smudges, just barely the little pink guys there. I realized when I was editing this that I apparently forgot to describe how platigage works, or what platigage is. It's basically it's a measurement tool for measuring bearing clearances. So basically what you do is you do a dry assembly of everything. You know, you put all your bearings in the block, you clean your crank, you put the crank into the block with no oil, because oil or any type of lubricant will throw off your readings. You know, you want to have nothing. You don't want to have anything that can affect the readings on there. So then you put your little strip of platigage onto the crank surface. Then you put your caps on, of course with the bearings inside the cap. You tighten everything down, torque it to spec, and then you pull everything back apart. That platigage is now going to be smashed against the crank surface. And then basically you're going to measure how wide that platigage smudge is. The tighter the clearance, the wider that smudge is going to be. The gauge comes with a gauge. It's on the package, and you basically compare the different widths on the package to how wide the smudge is on the crank, and that gives you a pretty rough idea of how wide your clearances are. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So back to the video. Number 5 looks good. It's on the platigage reading at 002. Number 4 is 003. Number 3, it's in between 002 and 004, so, or 003 and 004, so it's probably like 0035. Number 2, 003, and number 1, we'll go with 0035. And that's actually really close to what I measured using the other method, using a micrometer and a bore gauge. I actually got 035 or 0035 to 004 across the board. So that's not too far off from where we actually are. Like I said, that's at the very end of the service life for this crank. So that's going to be a fairly large clearance, a fairly wide clearance, but hey, I mean, race engines run wide clearances anyway, so should be alright. Good thing I went with that high volume oil pump. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this crap off the crank and start prepping this thing for actual assembly. So yeah, thanks for watching. Almost forgot, be sure to like the video if you liked it, leave a comment, and be sure to subscribe.